how do we personally navigate all of the various challenges and atrocities and things that are happening in the world right now? How do we hold space? How do we bring that into our activism? And overall, how do we be more human and see the humanity in one another to move towards a world that works for everyone? Hello, and welcome to Conversations for the People with Matthew Solomon. I'm Matthew Solomon, and I'm so honored to have Ash Gallagher on the show today. Ash is a veteran war journalist and an activist and an author and a consultant and speaker and educator who brings in her experience, her lived experience, her experience as a war journalist, her experience being a woman in the world, and her journey through observing violence, studying violence, teaching on systems of violence, but also what we can do on the other side to deprogram ourselves from that being our default and move into spaces where we are well and whole and collectively taken care of. Ash, thank you so much for being here. It's an
Yeah,
honor to have you on Conversations for the People.
thanks. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Yeah, I just, for the folks who are watching and listening, like we met I think it was a few months ago, honestly. Like we connected through Instagram and then we had a conversation and I started reading your work and everything that you're doing or for the folks who are listening, like we'll get into this later, but your work, like you're so vulnerable and so present and you share so much about your history as a veteran war journalist and how that ties to systems of violence, um, domestic violence. It's all interrelated. So, I guess I would love to jump in with your work now and with how you're showing up in the world now. Like, what is it that's present for you that you want people to really grasp at this time?
Hold on to grief. I feel like we live in a society, in particular in the West, where we're grieving a lot, but we don't know how to deal with it because we've been shamed from our grief. And that's when I say somatically, we've been shamed from it in our body. We've been shamed, in our personal circumstances. But what's happening in the world is going to affect us every single day because we're connected. And I think we need to hold on to that grief and we need to own that story. Because every single day, I think, I think grief can lend itself into moments of joy. It's not that we have to give up joy. I don't think we sacrifice joy. I think joy has room for grief. I think joy doesn't exist without grief. But I also think that we've been so pushed away from it, detached from it, that we forget that other people's pain is meant to be felt. We're meant to feel other people's pain. We're meant to feel other people's outcry. We're meant to feel other people's stuff, and it's going to affect us, and then we're going to have our own, and it's going to reflect back and reflect back. Um, so I don't know. If there was a message that right now feels so pertinent in the world, it's that one.
Hmm.
Like I don't know. Like I feel like there's different messages at different times, but I think the story of grief is permissible and it needs to show up and we need to be okay with it. We need to not have the steps to wash away the grief or to pray away the grief or to meditate away the grief or to therapy session away the grief, right? Like whatever your method of moving through difficult times is, you can't make it go away. You can't breathe it out. You actually have to integrate it. Uh, and it's okay and it's permissible.
Yeah. Wow.
I don't know.
it's funny because I would usually ask a question like that at the end, and something was telling me to ask that up front. And the minute you said, hold on to your grief, like I just felt that like in my chest. And one of the first things that came to mind, I mean, it was like we collectively, I mean, we're still in it, but the pandemic,
Yeah.
losing, like I lost a lot of people, like people, a lot of people have been lost. And and it was like, okay, now we get to go back to work. But then here's, this genocide that's happening here, and here are these bombings that are happening here, and all of that. And um like it's almost like, I don't know, like in one sense, how do we catch up? Or how do we discern? Or is it like, is this just what we're in right now, like one thing after
Right.
another?
I don't know if we ever catch up. You know what I'm saying? It's like, so for example, when you've lost a lot of sleep, theoretically, somatically, you never really catch up on sleep per se, right? So your body just finds a different rhythm that it needs. In the same way, I don't know if we catch up on grief. I think what's happened is we've compartmentalized these emotional parts of ourselves. So we're like, okay, grief over here, and you need to take time for this and take time for joy, and you take time. We've created compartments for everything, when in actuality we've got to just integrate it as part of our day. So I can, in one day, I can feel every single emotion there is to feel. That's an integration, and I don't shame myself for it. If I need a moment to go and experience my grief, take a walk, go, for a run, whatever. It's moving through that emotion and acknowledging it. It's saying, "Hey, I see you. I got you. I'm here." It's when those moments of laughter and pleasure and joy. And the irony is, the people that taught me how to do this were Middle Eastern people.
Mm.
The people that taught me how to do this were people in Gaza. And people that taught me how to do this were people in Lebanon. The people that taught me how to do this were Yazidis. The people that taught me how to do this were Iraqis. The people that I spent time with in the war zones taught me how integration is supposed to look. Because you could have 1 minute where you are running from bombs and bullets, and then the next day or the next morning or that evening, you're sitting out in front of a broken down house with a tea and having a talk about the latest corrupt politics or like whatever, right? The day to day. Or the kids who would be in the camps who always wanted to show off. Like I would go into the camps to do some sort of refugee or displaced story, and the kids would want to play in front of my camera, do flips, show me things, um, stuff like that. And so I remember one story in particular. I was doing a story about the traveling medical teams that were going to the displaced camp because they were taking care of the local diseases that were developing. And the kids were following me around for a while. At one point, this young woman comes up to me and she takes my hand and she pulls me out. This is in Iraq. And she pulls me out and takes me to the tent where her family was. And there were a couple of other women, some men who clearly were probably fighters, like militia fighters, a couple of older women, the mothers. There were 6 or 7 children, and they're all sitting around this hot plate of dolma. And they insisted that I sit down and eat with them. And one of the men said, "Look, I don't want you to think that because we don't have anything really, that we can't share what we do have." And they popped open a Coca-Cola for me and sat with me and wanted me to eat with them. And so I think in that moment, there was actually joy, right? These people have lost everything. They're cooking on a hot plate given to them by the UN to make the simplest meal they can come up with. And they're doing so with joy, all while they understand that it sucks to not have their house.
Mm.
All while they understand that they have to sleep on these makeshift mattresses in a tent. So on one hand, there is an aspect of grief, but on the other hand, there's little moments of joy and laughter and life. And so I think we have to honor the grief. We have to honor the hardship. We have to honor that hell is happening. And also let ourselves experience everyday life and just don't deny any of it. Don't compartmentalize it. Just let it exist.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, I think what you started with, like, or maybe it was before we started recording, that there's an ingrained thing how we've been socialized to deny that. Or yeah, you were saying like meditate it away, pray it away, like
Yeah.
but it really is, at least in my experience, like it makes it all richer, makes life richer to allow that and to
Mm-hmm.
experience that and sit with it. And to take it a step further, I think it makes us better humans to each other
Hmm.
to be able to sit there and be with another person's grief.
Yeah. I agree. I agree. I just had a moment with someone that, I had passed by and I could tell that the person was um, having a really hard day. And, she and I built up a rapport. And I just said, you could tell she didn't want to talk about it, but she
Mhm.
was feeling. And I just said, "Can I hug you?" And she said, "Yeah." And so I gave her a hug. And like that was a moment we shared in that grief. She knows that she's not alone. I hope so. And we go about the day that we need to do. And I think that's it. It's simple acknowledgement. It's simple, not just acknowledgement of each other, but of acknowledgement of ourselves. I saw a video recently that was basically Spain has brought in its first official Palestinian ambassador. I think he was already
Mm.
serving in some sort of capacity, but they've officially named him in title as the ambassador for Spain. And so he gets to meet in the video, he gets to meet the king, and there's kind of a ceremonial thing to it. And he comes out and he's beaming. He's just all smiles. He just looks like a kid on the playground who won
Mm.
a prize. Like he's just beaming. And it's funny because the comments in the video were amazing. It
Mm.
was like, look at what it is for him to just be acknowledged, for someone to just recognize him. Look at that moment. Like you see this moment of his big smile, and it's just like all the pain and grief he's holding, probably has lost family in Gaza, the occupied West Bank. Guaranteed he's lost family. And for just a moment, he's beaming because he's being recognized. Someone is saying, "You exist, you matter, we got you." And to me, I think that's vital. And I think we say that to ourselves too. Like, oh, you know what? I got this.
Mm.
And this isn't fun, but I'm gonna get through this day. It's just sort of a constant conversation, I think, within ourselves,
Yeah.
uh, to be more community. And you bring something up really interesting, and just in the terms of like maybe we would be better to each other. We've been so isolated, and COVID isolated us further. And coming back out into the world, into community, feels sometimes disingenuous or strange. I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know how do you perceive all that? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you asked me that because um I felt like when we were able to emerge, that people forgot how to be around other people. And like, as bad as people drove, like, I'm in LA, so as bad as people drove before the pandemic, like it got way worse after. Like in the middle, that was one of the positive things, was like, oh, there's nobody on the road. I can drive, I can get anywhere, in 10 minutes, 15 minutes, like I used to be able to do. But then once people started driving again, like you could just feel, like, even flying. I fly a lot, with my film, and there's just a high level of anxiety
Mm,
and everything that wasn't there before, getting on and off planes and
mm,
driving, going to the store, interacting with people. And I know, we weren't great at community before, but it does feel like it got worse in a lot of
yeah.
ways.
I wrote something recently on my Instagram. I think I put it on my Substack too, maybe, but I said basically something to the effect of, "I'm tired of our digital world."
Mm.
And I acknowledge the positives that our digital world has given us, a way to connect with people we might never connect with, creating movements, all of those kinds of things can be really amazing. Staying in touch with people you love and that are close to you. But it's also become a place of pain. There are those who use it to be avoidant, or those who use it to be unkind or to hide behind awful comments and DMs and whatever. And there's a whole side of it that is just almost degraded community, isolate away, never going outside. And so I sort of end the prose with, I'm tired of the digital world. I miss us. Like, I miss that connection. I want the digital world to be a liaison to those moments when we get to see each other, or those moments when we get to have meaningful connection, but not to the extent that we're causing each other pain. And I think COVID revealed us a little bit
Mm-hmm.
in that way. And I mean, it's great, like you and I get to do this podcast in this way, but at the same time, you know, it's not all there is, right? There's
Yeah.
so much more. And perhaps opportunities will be created in the future, like whatever, it's fine. But the point is that I want it to be a liaison of something that's more meaningful in our lives rather than the thing that keeps us boxed in.
Mm-hmm.
And we're hiding behind boxes sometimes with this stuff. And I think we've not quite recovered from that side of it yet.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really, yeah. I mean, that's spot on. And then, because it's not just COVID, because COVID happened, George Floyd was murdered, there were the, uprisings in the street, there were the elections in 2020, and then January 6th, and then, and all these other things, and then Gaza and everything. And so like even with the digital part that at times in my life was an escape, it's like every time I would get on another platform, like I would go on TikTok, it's like, oh, dance videos and whatever. And then within a couple weeks, because of what's important to me,
Right,
the algorithm switches. And so so
right.
it's not, and, I feel funny saying, oh, I want to escape, but sometimes you need those moments to just like, okay, I just want to watch something, that's going to make me
Sure,
laugh for a minute.
sure.
And yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah,
No, I agree with you. I mean, look, I'm somebody who loves comedy and artistry and cinema and and my algorithms regularly show me things like dancing and comedy stand up and
mhm,
I've got Netflix set to certain things that I like to watch and whatever. So I'm somebody who understands it's great to have those moments to have something to check out with. Um, and it's about creating balance. I think for
mhm,
me, the digital world is about creating intentionality. I do actually know how to turn it off. In fact, this past summer, I did not have a SIM card.
hmm,
So I have relied on Wi-Fi to check in on my phone. And the reason this was good for me is because it meant that when I went to go on a hike, and yeah, I can make emergency calls or I can pull my map up or there's functions. But when I would go for a hike, it's just me and the elements.
mhm.
No calls coming in, no dings on my phone of
Yeah, the
notifications.
dings, yeah,
Yeah, nothing. It's
yeah,
just me and the elements. And if I choose to like use my camera or my camera on my phone or something, like nothing's going to interrupt that. I have to be creative. And it's kind of a beautiful thing that I've done is I've sort of shied away from a SIM card for a while because it it forces me to, not be so damn busy on the phone
mm,
when I'm in transit or when I'm wanting to focus on something else. I joke that in New York City, you don't really need one anyway, because literally the subway has Wi-Fi.
yeah,
Um, but there is something to being able to just kind of connect with myself a bit by saying, you know what, I don't need to be on every second of the damn day.
yeah,
And I think maybe there's something from my journalist days that I'm trying to change because during my journalist days, I was on 24/7. I was on vacation for 10 days. I'm on 24/7. So if something else happens, I got to cut short and go back or whatever. And in a way, this forces me to say, you know what? I don't need to be in front of it every second,
Hmm.
all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I was going to ask you if, because I would love for you to share some about your experience as a journalist. And then
yeah.
I was curious if that how, what you were describing now informed how you were as a journalist, or if being a journalist informed how you were now. So you answered that. I was going to ask you that. But yeah, how, like what was it like being a combat journalist, and what was your day to day, and what drew you to that?
Um, I mean, I'll back up and tell the story. I was
Mhm.
19 years old the first time I voiced that I wanted to be a war journalist. I had a mentor who happened to have been a youth pastor at the church I grew up at, and he was very much a hero's journey guy. He was an Indiana Jones adventurist, playwright, creative human being. And he and his wife had me over for dinner one night, and we were talking about a book he had written, and which was kind of his version of Joseph Campbell's, kind of hero's journey. And we were dissecting it, and me at 19 years old at a community college, what did this mean for my life and whatever. And I just blurted out, it's like 11 o'clock at night. He's like, you want some more coffee? I'm like, sure, I'm a college student. I stay up till 5 a.m. And he's like, so what's the extreme dream? Like, what do I do? Like, well, I want to be a war journalist. And and he's like, those come a dime a dozen. You sure? It's like, yeah, I think so. Somebody's got to do it. And he's like, okay, let's make it happen. So he was the first person in my life that was like, yes, you just said a crazy thing, and I'm going to tell you yes. And to me, that was a big deal. And so I credit a lot of what I did to him and Sarah that night because they were with me and processing that. But I'm also a survivor of domestic violence. And so I actually wrote in the first chapter, I have a memoir out called Reckoning in the Rubble. But in the very first chapter, I talk about the fact that I think war at home gave me a subconscious mindset for the wars abroad. I wouldn't have known that at 19. I wouldn't have had that awareness back then. But I do think that I was probably looking for something familiar to understand myself. I look back now, I can kind of see that. But at the time, it was like the cool thing to do. I was a good writer. I, enjoyed, the cinematic side of life, right? And being a war journalist was sexy.
Mhm.
Uh, it's not sexy. It's very, it's hell. It's very difficult. But at 19, you have a totally different perspective.
Yeah.
So, so I did it, and it took me. Obviously, I spent really 18 official years as a journalist, 20, maybe 18 to 20, kind of in there, but a good decade of that was spent on
Wow.
the Middle East and being in the region and reporting on the stories. And so that kind of got me to there. I think it'll never leave me my ability to pay attention and to hold it. It turned me into an activist. I got to a point where I didn't want to dodge the bombs and bullets the same way like that anymore. I
Mm.
mean, I have mentors and beautiful journalists that I know who are in their 60s who are still dodging bombs and bullets. God
Yeah.
bless them. I realized I couldn't. And so it shifted the way that I work. But I took what, 20 years packed in of uh, storytelling, of learning how to be with people, how to hold that space, trauma. And then, as I began to train in other things, as I began to understand other things about the body, about my own healing, my own therapy I was going to, my own stuff I was dealing with, it was reshaping how I showed up. with it. I wanted to tell a story where it goes somewhere, because I do think
Mm.
that journalism gets stuck in the loop of trauma, trauma after trauma after trauma. And you're just sort of stuck in that same loop all the time, and it doesn't go anywhere in terms of healing or justice or solution or policy. Like we just kind of keeps echoing. So I think there was a need for me to seek out a way of storytelling that does go somewhere. It leads to a solution based idea or a justice movement or healing for personal or collective. Um, it needed to shift, and I needed that personally as well as
Yeah.
within the work. So I think that it informed me. Okay, it basically gave me an expertise in storytelling. And then I was able to look at that and go, oh, this is actually what trauma is. It's actually all about the story. Then I started learning somatic and body stuff. And I'm like, oh, that's how that. So it just became connecting those dots. But I couldn't be stuck in that loop anymore. And so I think that's how it shifted for me in a lot of
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah. So, it's interesting because I'm doing a lot of work now because of my documentary. There's always this kind of like journalism versus documentary, and which is more real, and which is, I'm so glad you said what you said about being stuck in that loop, because while I think journalism is, captures what's in the moment, and documentary tells a story, journalism tells a story also, but it's the whole thing about like if it bleeds it leads, and we have to document like the horrible stuff, is what we see
Right.
first, and it doesn't, like you said, it doesn't, like if I watch any news channel, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
local news, KTLA or MSNBC, like it's the same repetitive thing. There's
Right.
never solutions. And even when there's things about police violence or Gaza, the
Mm-hmm.
the experts that they have come on are always speaking in ways, not, they're not explicitly saying this, but it's all stuff that keeps us in the cycle. It's like, oh, well, we need to reform police and do more of this, versus no, we need to tear down the system, and or you know Israel has a right to defend itself, and so nobody's talking about like Palestinians being able to live,
Right.
and so I'm so
Which I
glad.
mean, that's it's you bring up the propaganda line that just drives me
Yeah.
mad, because I grew up with it, right? Like I
Yeah.
grew up in a Christian conservative home for the most part. I grew up we they started out by taking me to kind of Pentecostal churches. My parents came from Catholic families. And so I had an exposure to Catholicism when I was with my grandparents.
Mhm.
But then we were going to Pentecostal churches, and then we went to evangelical church. And the evangelical church is where you really heard the glorification of Israel. And you had the Israeli flag next to the American flag next to the Christian flag. Like these exist within churches across the country. Um, and I'm so tired of that line.
Yeah.
I am so, because they don't.
Yeah.
Israel does not have a right to defend itself. And according to international law, the ones that they occupy do have a right to defend themselves. And I learned that firsthand, but then you begin to see how much that is drilled into the messaging
Hmm.
and the conflation of everything. Um, and it's gotten to this point where I'm like, wait a minute. Even if somebody wants to say, okay, Palestinians have a right to self-determination, do they? According to the current sociological and political application, because under that system, they are not given that.
Hmm.
If we were to talk about the true self-determination and freedom of people, justice, healing, being able to have authenticity, um, then yes, they should be able to not just defend themselves, but have their own army, have their own forces, have their own government, right?
Hmm.
Um, I was listening to an analyst today or yesterday, say something about the fact that basically what happened with Palestine is they were given less than a state. They were said you could have less than a state. You can
Yeah.
have a right, and but you're going to be subjected to occupation. and the Oslo courts basically screwed them over.
Mm.
And so, and I won't get too far into all of that, but it is the understanding that Dr. Gabor-Mate talks about this. When we're born, we need two things. We need authenticity, so our self-determination, our self-sovereignty, our understanding of self. And then we also need attachment. We need relationship. So how do we take that on to the international scale? Well, Palestinians are denied their authenticity entirely, and the
Mhm.
relationship that they're forced into is an abusive one, for which they're occupied, for which they are end up in a trauma bond, for
Yeah.
lack of a better phrasing,
Hmm.
with their occupiers who are supplied by the West. Um, and so I think I got to a point when it comes to journalism, I reported a lot on the traumas. I was in Gaza in 2014, but I think there's a desperation for there to be solutions uh, that can create a pathway forward, because we can't keep doing like we can't keep doing this. We can't keep doing this.
Yeah.
Like, we're getting to a point where, is the grief too much? Is the grief so much that we can't, like, it's got to stop? The bombs and bullets have to stop. And I would
Mhm.
say that in a personal circumstance too, for people who have gone through abuse, for survivors. At some point, you get to a point in your relationship, you get to a point with parents, an ex-partner, whatever. It's got to stop, because you can't breathe. When our Black brothers and sisters went out into the streets during COVID, what was their slogan? I can't breathe. It's got to stop. The
Yeah.
violence, the harm, the horror. You can't even have a conversation
Yeah.
unless it just stops.
Yeah. When you, because I know you teach and you consult and you talk and write about systems of violence,
Yeah.
and what, like, it's interesting. There was a doctor, um I forget the type of doctor that studies diseases, but he was working with violence prevention workers in Chicago. And it was a
Okay.
documentary called The Interrupters, and he was talking about how he approaches violence as a disease,
Interesting.
as it's a disease where, oh, if this happens, violence is the only response. If that happens, violence is the only response. And so the way to interrupt that is to create different types of responses and discernment, and like our internal work and recognizing our reactions and our mechanisms and all that. But you look at it at a systemic level, which I also appreciate. And I'm curious your observations of that. Like, how is that system kept in place? But then also, how do we break free from that system, and what do we replace that with?
It's a really good question, and I think it's
Mm.
something that I still grapple with, because you're right. There's structures to it. There's structures and systems and layers to it. It's interesting that this doctor approaches it from a perspective of a disease, because then you have to talk about eradication. And I'm not sure I believe that eradication is possible.
Mm.
And that's also coming from the idea that, on one hand, I feel there's a piece of me that's kind of a pacifist. Like, I'm not pro violence at all.
Mm.
I'm not even pro like toy gun. Like, kids shouldn't even have toy guns. Like,
Yeah.
just no. But it's this idea that I also understand a certain level of reality. And I know that we both have an appreciation for kind of that somatic psychology, that body psychology, and we have a fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response within our nervous system. Um, the story for facing off with a threat is actually fight and flight are our first responders.
Mhm.
It doesn't mean that freeze and fawn never happen, but I think freeze and fawn happen when we're under so much abuse we don't know what else to do. Like, the overwhelm is too much.
Mm.
But our system is the sympathetic nervous system is our fight and flight. Irony, it's called sympathetic. And if you look at any of our cousins in the animal kingdom, they are going to fight or flight almost every time. It's very rare there's going to be a freeze and fawn. There's always
Yeah.
going to be a fight or flight. Even like a porcupine is built a certain way to, like, go after its enemies or a blowfish or something, right?
Mhm.
So there's always a fight and flight first. And I think what's happened is if we can understand that system, first of all, in our as the body, so the collective. So, and I know I go back and forth between them so fluidly, but I think it's important. If as a survivor of domestic violence, if I'm being beaten or raped or harmed, my first instinct might be to fight, to push back. Interestingly enough, in psychology, it's called reactive abuse, which I think is terrible.
Mm.
Because essentially what you end up doing is you say that we'll say just in a heteronorm situation,
Mm.
the woman is just as abusive because she reacted, because she pushed back, because she
Mm.
shoved back, right? When that's not necessarily the case, she reacted.
Yeah.
She was being threatened, she was being beat, she was being coerced, whatever the case was, and at some point she broke.
Yeah.
She pushed back, and that's her fight mode. Her fight mode is finally saying, I'm done, enough of this. A grizzly bear will roar to protect its little one.
Mhm.
And then eventually, what happens, our cousins in the animal kingdom, they have the ability to like run it out or go back to a state of rest, which is your parasympathetic, which is your freeze and fawn. But the healthy side of freeze and fawn is your state of rest. Your healthy side of that, right? Like your positive side of it's your ability to come back into a place where you could just be chill. Colonization, abuse, oppression, they have trained us to freeze and fawn all the time.
Mm.
And then we hold on to our trauma and we don't know what to do with it. And so when the bow breaks and someone fights or a resistance group fights, we condemn them. We say, oh, they're bad.
Mm. Right.
But we've been trained to not fight. So I think what has to happen in terms of solutions, right, is that there has to first be a recognition. There has to be, I go back to that piece about acknowledgement and recognition. It's the very simple nature of saying, oh, I see what's happening here. I see what you need. Let's let's figure that out. I acknowledge that. I acknowledge that pain. I acknowledge that horror. I acknowledge what happened. You have to acknowledge what happened. It has to start there. Because I think with that acknowledgement, think about any relationship you've ever been in, friendship, lovership, partnership, and you and your partner are having a struggle. And the moment you just stop and recognize their pain, what changes? They come back down. From
Yep.
whatever intensity or anxiety was happening in the moment. And I think we have to start there and then we can begin to have other conversations. Um, I think I sent you, I just want to say for all the
Mhm.
people out there, go to Netflix this week and there's a film on Netflix called Best of Enemies.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
everyone should watch it
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah.
It's with Teresa Henson and Sam Rockwell.
Yeah.
Did I say that right? It's the
Mhm.
actors. And they play two very real people who in 1971 had to face off over school integration. And um, uh, Ellis, the main character, Sam Rockwell's character, is the head of the KKK. And Henson's character is Ann Atwater, who was a Black activist in Durham, North Carolina, I think. And the the school for the Black kids gets burned. It's right around the time that integration is happening, and they have to figure out how to deal with it. And so they bring in this outsider, this professor, who runs these like meetings essentially. And he has to get everybody in the room. He's got to basically get all the white people and all the Black community and bring everybody into the room. But these two people cannot stand each other. He's head of the KKK.
Mhm.
She's a Black activist. They don't want to look at each other. They can't stand each other. And we know what the right side of history is in this point. I hope most people would know,
Yeah.
but still, he has to get them in the same room. Journalist and documentarian Dia Khan, you may know who she is. She has done a lot of work with white supremacist groups, and I actually really respect the work she's done. But what is the number one thing that all of these circumstances tell us? You just have to acknowledge the other person. And that's a very difficult thing for a lot of people to hear.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult thing, but you can't change the story for justice until you just like stop and acknowledge, stop and recognize, stop. Respect is look again. Respect is it regard and obedience. Respect is look again.
Yeah.
And so we have to start there. And that's a really hard place, I think, for people to go.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so counterintuitive in the way that we've been programmed and socialized.
Right.
And yet I've seen it, I've done it, I've seen it. It's in my conflict resolution work, it started working with couples and then it kind of grew because it's the same thing. Like people want to feel seen, heard, and understood, or seen, heard, and loved. And when you can acknowledge somebody's experience without adding to it, without making them wrong or trying to fix it, like when you can just acknowledge, yeah, I can get where you're coming from. That takes away so much of the crap that's in the way,
Yeah.
and then you can actually have conversations. So yeah, it's so important. Before we get into the last part, where can people find you? Where can they read your work? And
Yeah, sure.
yeah,
So my main website is just ashgallagher.com. I am on Instagram at Birth Revolution. And then I have both a Medium and a Substack. I know most people have like one or the other. My Medium tends to be a little more activist oriented, I think, whereas my Substack tends to be a little more body oriented. I call it Bodies in Resistance right now.
mm,
So it's really kind of looking at our sensuality, my personal experiences. I'm a little more prosy, I think, on Substack. Um, I talk a little more about sex, a little more about being a woman, a little more about kind of, but actually, I talk a lot about things like grief, kind of holding that collective grief. So it's just kind of what it's like to be in our body. Um, yeah, and then I kind of take it to the collective a little bit more with Medium, which is where you'll see a lot of my stuff on Gaza and Israel and all the things that we're seeing. So yeah, all
yeah.
those links I'll give you, but yeah, for sure.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we'll put all those in the show notes, and then you do consulting and all of that
Yeah,
as well,
absolutely.
which is really awesome. Um, Great. What? Just any final words? I'll just hand it over to you if there's anything.
I mean, we started talking about grief,
Yeah.
and maybe in a way, it's just where we are right now.
Yeah.
I think in the collective mindset, and I think the biggest thing I would just say is that joy holds room for grief. Joy holds room for the worst thing. Um, one of my favorite teachers is a man by the name of Rubble, who lives in LA,
Hmm.
and he talks about this idea that the truth is we're all going to die. We're not getting out of here alive.
Yeah.
So we might as well find the moments of joy, embrace the grief, and live to the fullest of who we are. And I think that's what I want my life to be. It's what I would want everyone's life to be.
Yeah.
Live feeling it fucking all. Yeah.
And breathe.
And
So
breathe.
take a big
Take a
breath.
breath. Take a breath. Yeah. I know.
Yeah, awesome. Ash, thank you so much. It's been
Absolutely. Thanks
just
for
a
having me
pleasure
on. I
having
appreciate that.
you.
It's
Yeah.
fun talking.
All right, big thank you to Ash Gallagher, and I'm going to take a couple deep breaths, and I hope that was as valuable to you all as it was for me. So, big thank you to Ash Gallagher. Make sure you follow her on Instagram, Birth Revolution. We'll drop all of her links in the show notes. And as always, make sure you check out Reimagining Safety at reimaginingsafetymovie.com and like, share, subscribe to the podcast. Keep this going. And until next time, thank you for watching and listening to Conversations for the People with Matthew Solomon, and all power to the people.